Welcome to part one of the exam access arrangements. My daughter's filming me, so we'll probably giggle for a bit. So there are going to be some other parts. This is on GCSEs and GCE access arrangements. There's going to be another one on Key Stage 1 and 2 and 3, and one on assessing those with EAL. But for now, on this recording, we're looking just at GCSE and GCE qualifications, and it is from the point of view of an assessor, not the SENCO. Because as we go through, you'll see the SENCO is pivotal to the entire process, and the assessor just has a part to play in it. We need to know about the SENCO's role, but we don't have that responsibility. But by knowing more about it, we can ensure that we're supporting them correctly. So we'll cover some useful sources of reference for you at the end. We'll think about different types of access arrangements, the process of doing an access arrangement, how we assess for them, how we liaise with the SENCO and fill in what's called Form 8. And as I say, access arrangements for other age groups we'll do in separate sessions. Access arrangements are based around the Equality Act of 2010. So basically it's any difficulty a candidate has is deemed as the candidate being disabled. So if their impairment has this is the actual words in the Act, a substantial and long-term adverse effect giving rise to persistent and significant difficulties. So if we have a pupil that becomes an exam candidate in that situation, it would be fair to make reasonable adjustments so that that candidate can access the examination, because they have the right to show what they know and what they can do, and not let something, for example, like slow reading speed or poor spelling affect that. If the exam is assessing geographical knowledge, your ability to write quick shouldn't impact on how you show what you know and what you can do, and that's what access arrangements are about. And you have to pick the access arrangement so that it is really going to support that individual. It's very specific to that individual, and it needs to be effective. For example, you could give a candidate 25% extra time. You could suggest that, they may qualify. But if they never use it, it's not really an effective access arrangement. So really the whole process is not just about a result that means you qualify for this, but that candidate's normal way of working, what teachers say, what teaching assistants say, what the SENCO gathers together as evidence. I've listed some of the access arrangements on your slides, from supervised rest breaks to scribes and the use of a word processor. It can be with spell check enabled or not, extra time, coloured overlays using an exam pen. There's lots of access arrangements. But which ones do we recommend and how do we go about it? Well, as an assessor, you can be involved in access arrangements in two ways. One, you've got your assessor's hat on. I write a diagnostic assessment report. I'm working out, do you have dyslexia or not? And I'm explaining why and giving recommendations. In my recommendations, I may suggest these would be useful access arrangements. That's one way we're involved, and that's largely what the AMBDA's about. However, you also qualify to do another thing, and that is administer, score and report your results to support a SENCO when they apply for access arrangements. And that's what I'm talking about today. The SENCO is at the heart of this process, and in all the information from the JCQ, the Joint Council for Qualifications, they say the SENCO must lead on the access arrangements process. must work with teaching staff and support staff, and must be supported by senior management team and other members of staff, and ensure that access arrangements are put in place for internal school tests, mock exams and exams. So it really is the SENCO leading the way, and you are just providing some evidence for that SENCO. So our role really is to support a SENCO. So before we begin in earnest, remember, a learner doesn't need a diagnosis, say of dyslexia, to have an access arrangement. We may think they're dyslexic, they haven't had a diagnosis, but if they've got a difficulty, whatever it is, how's that going to impact them, and what access arrangement do they need? They don't necessarily need the diagnosis, just proof that then in their normal way of working they are struggling, and therefore an exam, this would make the exam more fair for them. Largely, we would not assess for underlying ability for access arrangements. There are unusual circumstances sometimes when we're asking for exceptional levels of access arrangements where we might do that. I think I can explain that later. So if you have a formal diagnosis, you don't automatically get access arrangements. It's the evidence that's the main thing, and that comes from the SENCO, from assessment results and the pupil's normal way of working. If a centre, which is the term used for a school or college, whatever, if they receive one of your diagnostic assessment reports, really that is to guide them and maybe suggest there's a difficulty then they need to look at. They can't use your results for access arrangements. So that if your results on a diagnostic assessment report can't just be transferred to the school. So, what access arrangements are going to be applied for? Well, it depends on what you find in your assessments, and it depends on what the SENCO's found out about the candidate, the pupil, what their normal way of working is, and what type of subjects they're taking. And again, you can be involved in discussing it with the SENCO, but it's the SENCO that makes that decision. Access arrangements themselves fall into two groups. One that they describe as centre delegated. That means a SENCO has got evidence, written evidence and so on, normal way of working, and can decide you can use, for example, a word processor in your exam. They don't need to apply for it. But there are other access arrangements that a SENCO has to apply for, and they do it through this Joint Council for Qualifications, JCQ. And for example, let's think of a word processor with spell check enabled. Yes, you have to apply for that, and it would be through the JCQ. Now, there's 3 slides, and on the 3 slides you've got centre delegated access arrangements, things like if the candidate wants to read aloud or use an exam pen, or use a visual overlay or a word processor. So that's included on the list I've put for you. But when the SENCO has to apply, they need proof, and that's when an assessor comes in. So you're largely going to be asked to give proof for a bilingual dictionary with 10% extra time, a computer reader, the exam being on coloured or enlarged paper, 25% extra time, a reader, a scribe, extra time over 25%, and practical assistance for practical assessments or in written papers. They're the ones that SENCOs have to apply for, and they will want standardised assessment results to back up what they're saying, and that's what you can give as an assessor. The SENCO will be looking to paint a rounded picture, so they'll look at cognition and learning needs, things like dyslexia, communication and interaction needs, ASD, SLCN. We are not qualified to assess for that. Sensory and physical needs, hearing impairment, sensory processing impairment, physical disability, visual impairment. We are not qualified to assess for that. Social, mental and emotional needs, so ADD, ADHD and mental health conditions, and we're not qualified to assess for that. So really it's just in that top area of cognition and learning needs that we can be helpful. If other areas come up, you would have to refer or get the SENCO to refer to another professional, qualified professional. So in the other three areas of this, the communication, sensory and social, the SENCO can actually just gather lots of evidence and write to the JCQ with evidence to get access arrangements for those sort of pupils. Formal assessments not needed if the candidate has an EHCP, and reports or your assessment, when you go in and do your assessments, that can be any time within 26 months of the pupil taking the exam. So basically that means I assess and 26 months later they can do the assessment. So that means from the beginning of year 9 onwards you can assess, and whenever you assess, whether it's year 9, 10 or the beginning of year 11, those assessments will count for their access arrangements at year 11. So as an assessor, you've really got the duty to understand the JCQ rules, which I'll go through in a moment, the Quality Act of 2010, which I've referred to, that you work only in your area of expertise, know when to refer, and you use age-appropriate, nationally standardised, up-to-date tests which produce standardised scores, because that's what the SENCO needs. So the JCQ, basically, it's a membership organisation where 8 of the largest providers of qualifications in the UK are its members, and I've listed them on the slide in blue. And the JCQ provides a single voice for all those providers to be administering their assessments in a fair way and in the same way. So that's why the SENCO applies to the JCQ for these access arrangements, because it's trying to make sure it's doing it fairly, whatever the exam and whoever the candidate is. So if a school is thinking, right, we need to do access arrangements, no one's qualified, we need to employ an assessor, they can, from outside school, they can employ a psychologist, or they can employ someone with a level 7, like the one you have from Brooks. So that's the second one. And the third one is a specialist assessor. So that is the fact you've had level 7 from Brooks and you've also done your AMBDA, which has led to your APC. So you can be one of these two. Now, I will explain in a further presentation about the differences in qualifications, but not now. So you're gathering evidence, you have to conduct all the assessments yourself, so you can't have anyone else doing some of the assessments. They all have to be conducted by you. And you only really need to do assessments relevant to that child or candidate. So say if spelling is the issue, it might just be a spelling assessment you need to do that shows a low score, and their reading is fine, their comprehension is fine, so you wouldn't need to do those assessments. So you can pick and choose, cherry pick what you need to assess. You're not over assessing a child. Sometimes you will need to find and unpick what the difficulty is, but sometimes it's extremely simple and it's just 1 or 2 assessments. So the process overall, the centre employs an assessor. The SENCO gives you part 1 of Form 8, which I'll show you in a moment. The assessor and SENCO discuss what needs to be tested using part 1 of Form 8. The assessor administers and scores, and then records results on part 2 of Form 8. That is then given back to the SENCO. The SENCO then fills in part 3 of Form 8 and applies for access arrangements using Access Arrangements Online, AAO. If you work at the centre, if you happen to work at the school, the SENCO keeps those test papers either electronically or following GDPR in a locked cabinet. If you're a private assessor, you keep the assessment test papers electronically or in a filing cabinet that's locked following GDPR. If you keep files electronically, you need a backup of them as well, in case you were to be inspected and there was an IT problem. That's just the rules. The JCQ give the SENCO a calendar of dates, which covers a 26-month period. Right, access arrangements for this handed in then, for this handed in then. That is the SENCO's responsibility. But all you need to know is you can assess once the child begins year 9 onwards. So Form 8, what does it look like? Let's have a look. The SENCO will give you Form 8, Part 1, which is a history and evidence of candidates' difficulties, how the difficulties have impacted on teaching and learning in the classroom, and their normal way of working, and history of support given. So you've got a fairly clear picture of that pupil, from which you decide which assessments you're doing, and you can talk to the SENCO. To support you in doing this, there is in your email, there is an attachment that's called AMBDA Access Arrangements Need and Impact. It's actually a few pages. I've just done the first page on here, where you've got a characteristic, for example, difficulty with working memory. Then the next column, you've got possible impact during exams. So working memory could affect reading comprehension, recalling verbal instructions, proofreading, holding information long enough to write it down, etc., etc. It goes on. And then in the third column, you've got a possible access arrangement that you might be considering. So this is the sort of thinking that you need when you're looking at part 1 or talking with the SENCO about what's the difficulty, okay, what's the impact in an exam, what sort of access arrangement will they need, what sort of assessment shall I do? That's the sort of thinking process. So using background information to point you in the right direction. I've mentioned these things that you need to do all the assessments, and it's really helpful if you or the SENCO let the parent know you are not making the decisions about access arrangements, the JCQ are. You're gathering evidence, SENCO's applying, JCQ award or don't award them. In certain circumstances, awarding bodies themselves can give access arrangements, but again, that's something the SENCO would be involved in. So, if you Google JCQ Form 8, that will come up, and you click on here, and you then get Form 8. This is part 1, and it's basically where the SENCO fills in blurb about the pupil, the centre number, the exams they're taking, their exam number and so on. Then the SENCO fills in the candidate's history of difficulties as we've discussed, and that's part 1. Part 2. So after obviously part 1, you've had your discussion. Now you're going in, you've done your assessments, and you're going to fill in, so this is the end product, you're going to be filling in part 2, which looks like this. Basically, it takes you through different areas. For example, reading speed. Does the candidate read continuous text at a speed which is below average? Yes or no? Tick yes or no. So 84 or below, it's yes. You put the name of the test ceiling being the oldest age that can take that test, date that you administered it, and the score. Writing speed. Does the candidate write at a speed which is below average? And you get the same again. Evidence for a scribe, it will ask you about spelling, and you've got the same again. You've got about spelling accuracy, and then it goes on to writing regarding an access arrangement for a scribe. It does ask you a few questions that you make a qualitative decision on. So, is the candidate's writing grammatically incomprehensible to someone who is not familiar with it? Does the candidate's handwriting render his or her writing largely illegible to someone who's not familiar with it? So you're thinking, use your information from your dash for that. And the third question, is the candidate's writing speed in the below average range? Obviously you're using dash for that. Then it goes on to other relevant information. This is if your Senko is applying for over 25% extra time, that can be up to 50%, or a language modifier. So you can refer back to the sheet I made when you think about over 50% extra time, over 25% extra time, you're thinking of the processing and the type of difficulties they might have and the type of assessments you might use for processing for that. And if there's a language modifier that the Senko is interested in using, then they might ask you to be looking at verbal ability and vocabulary, so possibly a writ. And that's information the Senko would put, you would put in there that the Senko can refer to. Part 3, nearly there. You've got to finish part 2 by ticking about your qualifications and proving you've got them. So basically you'd either go to be a specialist assessor with a current SPLD assessment practicing certificate. So that means you've done your level 7, you've got your AMBDA and you've applied for an APC. Or you can be an access arrangements assessor who successfully completed a postgrad course at or equivalent to level 7, including at least 100 hours relating to individual specialist assessment. That means you've done your level 7 at Brooks and you've got your AMBDA. So it's one of those. Part 3, so our bit's over. And this is the part that Senko fills in saying what access arrangements they're actually going to apply for. Computer-based assessments can be useful, but caution's needed with them. Screening tests are not used in access arrangements. If you use Lucid, you've got to do paper tests alongside it anyway. So you have to be really thoughtful about which assessments you're using and follow the rules that the JCQ set out about them being standardised, that they're reliable, that they're up to date, and so on. We've discussed this before about the not the integrity of a test, but the reliability of it. Okay, what I'm going to quickly do now is go through some of the access arrangements and the tests that you could be using for them. The JCQ have got a list which I gave you for higher education, so that's more for disabled students allowance. Ann Arbor and Pearson's do tend to list some of their assessments that they sell and which ones the JCQ are happy for you to use. These are written down based on what is in the Pathos book, which has got, I think it's in chapter 5 or 8, it might be chapter 8, and it's got a list of assessments that you can use for each type of skill or ability. So 25% extra time. You might want to say, is there a difficulty with working memory? So you've got your TOML and RAML. Difficulty with phonological processing, you've got, for example, your CTOL. Visual processing, you've got your STMT. Or speed of reading, something like YARC. Obviously, there's lots, as long as it's a continuous piece of text that you're timing them reading. Reading efficiency, you've got your TOWRE. Speed of reading comprehension. So what's the thinking time when I have to comprehend? The DRA measures that. and speed of writing, so you've got your dash. Once you're going to go for 26% or more extra time, the candidate has to have 2 scores, not of 84 or below, but of 69 or less. And so you're looking at speed of reading, of writing, and of cognitive processing as well. So that last little section in part 2, you can add extra information there towards this. If your access arrangement is a reader or computer reader, again you're needing 2 scores 84 or below, and there's quite a few tests, so I won't go through them, but you're basically going to be assessing for reading accuracy, so an untimed single word reading test, reading comprehension of text or sentences, reading speed of continuous text, and an approved application for a reader will also grant 25% extra time. Are you assessing to get a scribe or scribe equivalent? Then you're going to be looking at 2 scores of 84 or less. Spelling, which renders writing incomprehensible. Free writing that's not legible to others. Grammatically incomprehensible writing. Writing produced slowly. So you're largely looking at dash and some of the spelling tests or writing assessments within these other tests like academic achievement battery and so on. Right, I've referred to this, and it is a list of assessments that you can use. So I've just basically gathered them under those different headings, the different types of access arrangements, but largely for access arrangements for GCSEs, do you fulfil the criteria by the JCQ? And that's written in green, and it's questions like when was your assessment published? Do you have the up-to-date edition? What age range does it cover? Has it been standardised using a large and diverse sample population? So they're the type of questions we asked ourselves about which assessments should be used in the first instance in our AMBDA course. Right, the assessments are done. You report the results in section 2 of Form 8. This can be done electronically, typed or written. And obviously you discuss this with the SENCO hopefully, who then goes on to fill in part 3. As I've said, the schools, if you work at the school, the SENCO keeps it, but other than that you can keep the paperwork, but follow your GDPR. Now, largely, 1 score of 84 or less will possibly get you some access arrangements. 2 scores, you know, you're building a picture of need, but you're looking for 84 or less. But as we know, many of our pupils score between 85 and 89. This is still in the low average range. And if there's an accumulation of those, they're going to be struggling and they deserve access arrangements. So 2 or more scores between 85 and 89, the SENCO can still apply for an access arrangement. And again, we might get a really bright pupil and they've got scores between 90 and 94. That is in the average range, but maybe compared to their ability, it's very different. So the SENCO could still apply for them as well. It's unusual circumstances, but it can still be done. This is in the JCQ information, which I'll give you a reference for in a moment. And this is the moment. References. Google JCQ access arrangements. You come through to here. Click on the PDF and up comes a very lengthy document with absolutely every bit of information you will ever need to know about access arrangements. It goes into lots of chapters and very usefully, for example, chapter 5, you think, oh, I'm not too sure about the rules for 25% extra time, that's page 22, or I'm not sure about a word processor, page 42, or language modifier, what's all that about, page 53. So you've got all the details on the different pages there, so please make use of that. Useful reference number 2 is a book produced by Patos. So Google, Patos, Assessing the Need for Access Arrangements. The book looks like that. it's £21. It's a real Bible for Senkos. It's very helpful for assessors as well. Reference number 3, Patos again. Google Patos AA resources and it goes further, but there's lots of different resources on there. It gives you, for example, the updates. Every academic year there's a change to the rules, and it will show you the updates, which is sort of an update to the book that they produce, which is a much easier to read book than the JCQ regulations. So that's a handy page to look at. If you Google SASC access arrangements, they've got information on there. It's not a very it's very helpful, but it's not very easy to use or read. But they do have lots of in-depth information. Obviously, they're the SPLD Assessment Standards Committee, so there's useful things on there about access arrangements too. And the British Dyslexia Association, they have some information. There's a couple of videos you can look up, but they're not as in-depth as you'll probably need them. It's more general and helpful for non-specialists, although they do courses on access arrangements that are at the right level for us. Now, that's largely covering being an assessor and helping a Senko. What about our diagnostic assessment reports? Well, as I've mentioned, with those, a report may contain useful information for the centre. That's what the JCQ says. And that a report is useful in gathering a picture of need or demonstrating a normal way of working, because that's what the Senko is going to need for access arrangements. So in your actual assessment report, it can't be used as an application. So you need to make that obvious when you report what you think would be useful access arrangements. So I always put a little blurb at the beginning of the access arrangements part in my recommendations, explaining that this is actually the prerogative of the Senko. And if it's for a much older child, that the JCQ actually award access arrangements. However, from this assessment, these scores suggest that pupil would qualify for, and then you list. So I would just suggest that in your diagnostic long, big assessments, you have a little preamble before your access arrangement suggestions. And also, if you are processing personal information at home, you need to notify the Information Commissioner's Office. It's just linked with GDPR. We will talk about that at another time. And as an independent assessor, you'd need adequate insurance for legal expenses in case someone disagrees with the diagnosis or your recommendations and there's legal action. But again, we'll talk about that in another session. So hopefully that's given you the general impression of access arrangements and your role as an assessor supporting a Senko, and also the knock-on effect of that to our diagnostic assessment reports. Thank you.